Thank you all for coming. We are so proud to have you here tonight. To my left, your right, Jacinda Ardern, twice recognized as a member of the Time 100. You can applaud that. Your leadership defied global trends when it comes to both gender and age. You were on the cover of Time in February 2020, and our Belinda Luscombe, who despite being Australian, wrote, Ardern's real gift is her ability to articulate a form of leadership that embodies strength and sanity, while also pushing an agenda of compassion and community. She spoke to Sam Neill, another treasure of New Zealand, who said, wherever I go, people say, you think we could have Jacinda this week? Could we just borrow her for a while? Tonight, we have Jacinda with us, and the United States has borrowed her for a long stay. So we're grateful to have you here.
Thank you. Happy to be here and blending right into this chair for this conversation.
Thank you. Get comfortable. All right. No offense meant, but New Zealand is a small country. 5 million people responsible for a tiny fraction of global emissions. How can small countries like yours lead the way on climate action?
You make an excellent point. 0.17% of global emissions you can attribute to New Zealand. And when you break that down, roughly half of those for us are coming from food production and agriculture. The fact that cows burp is a significant problem for New Zealand. And yet it was for us, the point that we were always trying to make in tackling our emissions profile was we have no place asking the rest of the world to do their part if we're not willing to do ours. And that is the issue that we face with the global challenge of climate change. If anyone opts out because their contribution is too small, at what point is the cutoff in place? And the second point for us was actually, as a country that has significant renewable electricity generation, on a good day it's well over 80%, some of our low-hanging fruit is gone. We're tackling the hard stuff when it comes to, for instance, the contribution of methane to our emissions profile. But if we can start trying to tackle that now, then we're going to have intellectual property that is going to be useful to the world and to the world's food producers. So there is advantage to us doing our part as well. So those are just a few reasons.
In 2022, you were the rare head of state to visit Antarctica.
Yeah.
I believe we have a photo of you. Let's see if it comes up. There you
it's
are.
A picture of me probably looking very cold and bulky.
Beyond what to wear in Antarctica, what did you learn there?
Apart from the fact you do need to wear a large platform boot to protect yourself from the cold, and the fact that I have never been to a place as quiet. It's almost, I can't even explain it to you. It was life-changing. In part it was life-changing because I've long had an obsession with Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton. The trip to Antarctica taught me many things, but one thing that was really critical was that it put a physical picture for me to all of the science and the research that we hear. It's one thing to hear about the depletion down in Antarctica and the fact that, the rate of global warming on average is twice in Antarctica the rate that we're seeing elsewhere. But when you see the sheer magnitude of that place on Earth and what that melting will mean for the rest of the world, it's almost overwhelming. But the second thing, I had the opportunity to stand in one of Shackleton's huts. And he was a man who set out to, of course, place the British flag in various parts of Antarctica and be a first on a number of things. And for those of you who know his story, you'll know that he failed multiple times. But what he became known for was his leadership. And one of the things that he used to say is that optimism is true moral courage. And I can't think of a better statement that we need in the climate battle right now. Some people frame optimism as somehow being optimism bias and they're naive or perhaps dangerous. In my view, optimism is actually about maintaining expectation. And if we drop our expectation and resign ourselves to the idea that our planet is irreversibly warming and there's nothing we can do about it, then policymakers and decision makers and politicians stop acting because the expectation is gone. I have an expectation bias. I expect politicians to do their bit. I expect policymakers to, and I expect private institutions to as well. We all have to maintain our expectation bias. That's true moral courage as well.
One of the things that I believe you're optimistic about is the protection of marine areas. And that's something that you've prioritized. Why are you focusing on it?
I think perhaps visiting the region and seeing how climate affected Antarctica is reminded me of how important it is to preserve those areas that are so affected and preserve the ecology of those areas for the species that are dependent on them. So I'm a Conservation International fellow, and as part of that work, we're doing as much as we can to convince those members who have a stake in the region to designate more marine protected areas. We're fighting at the moment for 4 additional marine protected areas, and if we are successful, I think we'll do 2 things. Firstly, we'll see the largest singular set of marine protected areas that we've ever had in our history, the size of the EU protected. But another thing that I think is equally important as a message to the world, we will do it at a time where it feels like geopolitically and geostrategically it's so fraught. You know, it's very hard to see any area where you see political actors acting together. And yet historically in Antarctica we have. In the midst of the Cold War, you saw the world coming together to protect Antarctica. And in my view, we need to do it again for what it represents, but also to send a message. The world is a dumpster fire. People are pointing at the dumpster fire and saying, there's a fire, put it out. And politicians need to act on that.
The world is a dumpster fire.
Geopolitically, it feels that way sometimes.
Well, I'm curious. You have a lot going on this week. One of the things you'll be doing is announcing the Earthshot Prize finalists tomorrow. What would you say to someone who said by focusing on innovation, you're letting, let's say, the arsonists who caused that dumpster fire off the hook?
I think with the Earthshot Prize, you're right, I'm a trustee for the Earthshot Prize. Prince William's endeavour to replicate this idea of the moonshot and try and speed up the activity that we need, not just in climate change, but to restore our planet, to clean our air, to reduce waste, and to protect and repair our oceans. So there's 5 different categories. And you're right, there'll be announcements tomorrow on finalists. If you look at past finalists, you really get the sense this isn't about pinning all of our hopes on innovation. It's about recognizing where we are in the here and now. One of our past recipients, for instance, Wild Marine Aid, is actually about bringing together civil society and others to enforce marine protected areas. It's one thing to designate, it's another thing to enforce. So the Earthshot Prize is a reflection of what we need and the pace we need in the future, but not just relying on big ticket new ideas alone. And the second thing I'll say is we cannot take our eye away from the responsibility that everyone has in the here and now. If there's one thing that I cannot understand why we still have the existence of, it is fossil fuel subsidies. $7 trillion going into subsidizing what is, of course, a major contributor to the situation we find ourselves in, but, at the same time, could be investment that would see in incentivizing and accelerating the investment in renewable uptake and use. So we need to push on both.
I'd love a little inside advice from a former insider as someone who led a government. For those of us in this room who are frustrated with the pace of change or maybe the intelligence of change of our political leaders, how do we motivate them to action?
I think one thing to remember, I think, is that despite that sometimes you see these cycles of change, you'll have perhaps a climate activist government in office and then perhaps one that's not. That each time the bar gets lifted, and then there is a new bar for where the private sector needs to look to if they want regulatory certainty. I'll give you an example. When we were in office, we said we have to plan for the transition. We will no longer issue offshore oil and gas exploration permitting in New Zealand because we have to send a signal that in the next, coming decades, this is an industry that we have to call time on. And so this is about planning for that future. There's a new government in New Zealand now, and they've lifted that. But we have now sent a signal to industry about what to expect when there's a change in government. The bar has been lifted. And in a sector where they look for regulatory certainty, that's now where they have to look. The second point, if we think about the climate environment as being a playing field, government can adjust the rules of the game. They can speed it up, they can slow it down, you'll see how they can adjust how many points are scored, but they are not the only players on the field. The private sector are right out there, either waiting on the sidelines to see who's going to go out and get their boots dirty, or in some cases and increasingly out on the field themselves. So are our citizens, civil society, consumers. We all have a part to play. Let's keep dragging government with us to make sure that it's a high-scoring game.
So that is the insider perspective. I'd now like a little bit of your outsider perspective. You visited the Democratic National Convention this summer. There have been columns written saying that there are lessons from your candidacy and leadership for Kamala Harris's. What have you learned as a spectator of the U.S. political process?
In 2 minutes and 14 seconds. I think the lessons piece is probably just drawing a comparison that when I became leader of the New Zealand Labour Party, it was 7 weeks out from an election. My boss literally arrived at work one day, the leader of the Labour Party, and he quit. And then he nominated me, and I found myself running.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, I think that's. I think perhaps that's the comparison that's being drawn. I think one of my observations, and the United States is not alone in this. There is a sense that the world, particularly Western liberal democracies, feels highly polarized at present, hyper-partisan. And that does not always feel like the kind of environment where you can make progress on existential crises like climate change. And yet I'm so fascinated that climate is often put up as one of the issues that perhaps people are divided on. And yet the United Nations Development Programme just this year did a survey on where citizens of the world, but particularly in high-emitting states, what their view of climate change is. And in the United States, the number of people who wanted their government to do more and more quickly was 66%. It's probably higher than what most people would assume. And that, amongst high-emitting states, was one of the lowest figures. 86% of people want their governments to work with others to speed up the climate transition. I think one of the things we confuse is that for a long time we've told voters that climate change is going to cost them money. And that doing nothing is the cheaper option. It is a false economy. Doing nothing is going to come at the expense for consumers. Oil and gas prices will continue to increase. Sea bans will have an impact. The cost of weather events and insurance and all that will flow from climate inaction will cost consumers. If we as politicians want to remain focused on improving the lives of our citizens, that all points to climate action.
Jacinda Ardern, a Time 100 leader. Thank you for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.